Michael Von During. I am the technical specialist for the Smallholder and Agri SME Finance and Investment Network. That's SAFIN, which is housed at IFAD based in Rome. Just a couple of words on SAFIN. For those who don't know us, we're a very diverse network of about 56 partners who've basically come together around a shared interest in improving the ecosystem for agri-SME finance. We basically collaborate around advocacy, knowledge sharing, knowledge development, and the co-creation of investment solutions. The reason we've invited you all to join today is that we're very honored to be able to put forward the launch of a new study on the effectiveness and efficiency of business development services for agri-SMEs. To give you a little bit of background on this study, it was initiated by Agriterra, who basically brought on ISF Advisors, one of the SAFIN partners, to lead the study. All of the results of the study can be found on both of our websites. I'm sure some of our other partners as well. The objective was to really help identify and assess the efficiency and effectiveness of BDS tools and methodologies that are currently provided to agri-SMEs, with a real focus on Africa through this one study. The study itself also brought together a steering committee that included Agriterra, Small Foundation, SAFIN, but also the Argidius Foundation, AMEA, and AGRA. The process for the study itself, it was led through extensive desk research, as well as the analysis of data collected from 15 business development services or BDS providers, through case studies and interviews with stakeholders, including some work on the ground. And really, I think in terms of the intended audience, we're really trying to reach the broader BDS service community, which includes the donors, the providers, and the recipients, with hopefully some really interesting findings and lessons for them to apply going forward. So now just moving on to the agenda for this session. We're going to start with a presentation of the study, the process that was led, as well as some of the key findings. That's going to be presented by ISF Advisors. And that will be followed by some brief interventions from a donor and a BDS provider, and to representation from Small Foundation and AMEA. We'll then open up to a Q&A for about 20 minutes before closing. And so just to set some ground rules on how we're going to proceed, we've got a pretty large audience. And so in order to make sure that we can, get to all of the questions and try to keep this as tight as possible within the 1 hour we have, we're going to ask everyone to please stay muted through the session and provide any questions that you have in the chat directly. What would be really appreciated is that you also include your name and the organization that you represent, so that we can refer to you when we get to your question. And finally, anyone who would like to take a second to introduce themselves through the chat, so that we get a little sense of who's here with us today, that's very much welcome as well. So I want to thank you all again for joining. I'd like to move on now directly to the presentation. So I'd like to introduce Hayden Aldridge, who's a manager at ISF Advisors, and his colleague Matthew Newman, who's a senior associate And a few words on ISF Advisors, which is a leading strategic and financial advisory group that's committed to mobilizing capital for a more sustainable, equitable, and productive global food system. Hayden, Matthew, I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you, Michael, for that introduction. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today. We're really excited to discuss this work that we spent a lot of time working on and looking forward to getting into this. So as mentioned, Matthew and I will spend the next 20 minutes or so discussing the headlines around the methodology, key findings, and recommendations that came out of this study. So we want to hop right in here. As Michael mentioned, the overall objective of this engagement was to identify and assess the efficiency. So what is the cost, as well as the effectiveness? Does the BDS lead to growth or resilience or other outcomes of BDS tools and methodologies? Within that, there are a few more kind of specific goals, including building more sophisticated and fit for purpose segmentation approaches, building on previous learnings to deepen best practices and findings related to the needs of agri-SMEs, as well as the tools and the models that could potentially improve BDS provision. So we accomplished these objectives and these goals in three kind of distinct phases of research. The first of which was framing and segmentation. The second was data collection and analysis. And the third was data interpretation. So in terms of that first section of research, we during this framing and segmentation phase, we really built upon the large existing swath of research that's out there. And we do want to acknowledge how much research is out there on this topic. But we built upon this to develop a conceptual framing and segmentation approach with our steering committee. We then worked with 15 BDS providers operating in East and West Africa as case studies. And just to note, these organizations were selected to ensure that the sample that we were working with varied in terms of scale of provider, geography working in, type of enterprise, and various other criteria. And then we collected qualitative and quantitative data from these providers, which resulted in a provider level and enterprise level data set that we then analyzed using an Excel-based benchmarking tool developed by ISF Advisors. And finally, we interpreted all of this data using a segmentation approach to ensure, as much as possible, a like-for-like results. And we incorporated qualitative feedback from the providers we worked with based on a long series of interviews, as well as an in-person workshop with all of the providers. So I just want to take some time here to acknowledge and thank these 15 organizations that we worked with, many of whom I know are on the call today. So hello and welcome to all of you. We worked really closely with these organizations to collect incredibly in-depth enterprise level data. It took a lot of effort and hard work from their end to ensure that we had a successful data set to work with. So thank you to you all for that. In total, these organizations provided us data on 509 enterprises operating in East and West Africa. And just to give you kind of a scale of the data set that we were working with, if we summed all of these enterprises, agri-enterprises together collectively, the revenue was more than $400 million. They accounted for more than 4,300 full-time employees. And in terms of, and just to give perspective, the absolute impact created following BDS interventions across this entire data set, there was roughly $36 million in total revenue created, over 2,700 total full-time employees created after BDS provision, roughly $100 million of capital raised. And all of this kind of came in at a cost of roughly $4.2 million to provide these business development services. So I'm just giving you these figures to get a sense of scale of the data set that we worked with. But let's switch gears now to discuss these findings at a more enterprise level, and to get into some of the real meaty takeaways from this analysis. So overall, broadly speaking, this study found that business development services provided to agri SMEs are effective and efficient at generating outcomes for revenue, employment, and capital raise, which were kind of the three key outcome metrics that we looked at. In terms of cost outcomes, the median cost per enterprise in the data set was roughly $2,700 per SME served. The median revenue created following BDS provision was roughly $28,000 per enterprise, with a revenue created to cost ratio. So think about, for every dollar of revenue created, how much did it cost? That ratio was 7-to-1 across the data set that we worked with. In terms of employment outcomes, roughly 3 FTEs were created per enterprise, at a cost of roughly $617 per FTE created. And finally, the median amount of capital raised for enterprises that did raise capital was roughly $28,000 per enterprise, with a capital raised to cost ratio of 12-to-1. So really importantly here, as we all are probably aware on this call, BDS is incredibly context dependent. So these high level kind of median numbers that we're showing on this slide here really only tell the tip of the iceberg of this whole story. There's obviously a ton of variation beneath these headline results based on the context of each BDS, right? The segment of the recipient of the BDS services, the objectives of the engagement, the market context, the geographic context. So we do further unpack these details and contextual nuances in the full report. And ultimately, the study established kind of 5 key conclusions that aim to really capture and explore these contextual nuances. So I'll cover these 5 key findings at a high level here, but I do, again, encourage everyone to view the full report for all of the kind of supporting detail and evidence and analysis and really the nuance for each one of these. But for time's sake, we'll kind of hit the high level headlines for each of the 5. So the first kind of key conclusion had to do with cost efficiency drivers. We found that while many factors drive the cost and the efficiency of BDS provision, 2 kind of cross-cutting drivers had the largest impact. The first would be service delivery model, or SDM for short, and the starting size of the enterprise that was served. In terms of the service delivery model used, to give some context, BDS delivered through group-based models were less costly on a per enterprise basis than those delivered via individual-based SDMs, and also provided more efficient revenue and capital raised outcomes. In terms of the starting size of enterprise served driver, providing services to smaller firms, again, kind of intuitively is just less costly on an absolute basis, and can also achieve kind of more cost-efficient outcomes for certain outcomes, such as FTE creation, than serving larger firms. However, and I think this is very intuitive, serving larger firms can lead to kind of higher absolute impact, just more total jobs created, and so on. The second driver, or kind of key conclusion that we came to, had to do with fee coverage, enterprise fee coverage, which we defined as when the enterprise that's being supported via BDS shares a portion of the total cost of the BDS provision. So for context, roughly 40% of the study sample paid for services in some way. And the kind of driver of whether this fee coverage happens or not appears to be primarily driven by enterprise stage. So later stage firms more often pay a fee than earlier stage firms, as well as service delivery models. So firms receiving individual SDM BDS tend to pay more than those receiving BDS via other SDMs, such as group-based models. And really interestingly, the firms that paid a fee did experience higher impact across all key metrics. So revenue outcomes, FTE outcomes, capital raise outcomes, relative to those firms that did not pay any fee. An important note here, and we do go into this in more depth in the report, but this data does only indicate whether or not firms paid at all, rather than kind of the nuanced aspect of willingness to pay or even ability to pay, which there are key differences there, right? Some contexts, such as certain donor-led programs, actually don't have an option for direct enterprise fee coverage. So again, there's more discussion around that in the report, but it's important to note that we really do focus primarily on the outcomes of fee coverage, which, as you can see, there are some really positive trends associated with enterprise fee coverage. The third kind of conclusion that we saw was had to do with segmentation approach. So I think we're kind of well aware at this point that high quality BDS should really be driven by enterprise specific needs, but segmenting the recipients of BDS is really crucial for determining the most relevant type of BDS, especially at scale. So, designing a large scale program that's going to address a number of different SMEs or enterprises, it's really important to kind of use segmentation from the onset. And we found throughout this analysis that kind of two types of segmentation were most commonly used by providers, and that was the type of enterprise. So think something along the lines of cooperatives or producers relative to other agri SMEs, such as processors. And the other was maturity of enterprises. And those are kind of the two most commonly used segmentation approaches. Providers really often rely on this more simple segmentation approach at the start, and then prior to evaluating more specific needs on a case-by-case basis and kind of building out a program based on those more specific case-by-case needs. Our fourth conclusion had to do with what we're terming kind of scale of providers. So for context, if we think back to those 15 providers that we worked with as case studies, we included a roughly equal mixture of what we termed as local providers and global providers. So local were defined as those that operate either regionally or locally in the specific region or country of its headquarters, while global providers were kind of larger international organizations with multiple programs operating in various geographies. And our analysis found that a significant gap in cost between those two types of providers exists for delivering the BDS, as well as a gap in efficiency of outcomes. So for context, local providers are just significantly less costly on an absolute basis than global providers. They come in at around $1,000 per enterprise served, while global providers on a median basis were $4,000 per enterprise served. And local providers also delivered kind of more efficient revenue, FTE, and capital raised outcomes. Now, I think it's really important to note that we found, along with kind of differences in operational overhead and structure between these two types of providers, differing kind of program offerings and market and system building objectives do appear to drive a lot of this dynamic in difference in costs. And there's some really interesting kind of findings in the full report about different approaches that these two types of providers may have to delivering BDS. And finally, the last kind of finding was a bit of a reflection on the process. We, again, worked closely with 15 BDS providers to collect and analyze all of this data. And as we did so, we encountered several kind of recurring barriers and challenges throughout the entire process. These included really wide variations in data quality and sophistication of the underlying data that we were working with. Assessment methodologies and objectives differed significantly across the ecosystem and are honestly often developed in a pretty ad hoc and isolated manner. And then finally, we did encounter a real lack of alignment on qualitative definitions and terminologies, which make you know, a like-for-like comparison, which we're attempting to do, quite difficult at times. So I'll pause there, and I'll now hand over to my colleague Matthew, who will run us through a set of recommendations that build upon these key findings. So Matthew, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Hayden. So as Hayden mentioned, we did an extensive amount of work collecting data, analyzing the data, and then drawing conclusions. But we really wanted to tease out what are the key things that funders, BDS funders and BDS providers could do to really improve the provision of BDS services on the ground. And so for funders, we were able to identify kind of 4 key recommendations for best practices. The first one being that funders need to recognize and have a clear understanding of what the underlying cost drivers and impact drivers are. And so the key kind of component of this is that when building programs for funders, funders can use various segmentation approaches like the one that we outlined in the full report to identify the right types of services, right mix of services, as well as the right types of SDM models to achieve or to appropriately target the type of enterprises that they want to target and achieve specifically the type of outcomes that they want to achieve through the program. And then secondly, funders should work to encourage increased fee coverage and look to work with providers that have some level of cost sharing with the underlying enterprises that they're working with. So as Hayden mentioned on the previous slide, we overwhelmingly saw from the data a benefit, cost and performance benefits when enterprises pay some fee for service. So funders would be better served, pushing the industry in this direction and increasing cost sharing, across the BDS landscape. In addition, funders should look to work with BDS providers that might be trying out new innovative methods in order to increase fee coverage, such as taking payment in kind or integrating BDS payments with interest payments, etc. And then the third thing that donors can do is to work to prioritize identifying and working with high quality local BDS providers. So as Hayden mentioned in the last slide, local BDS providers tend to have advantages in terms of effectiveness and cost efficiency. That's not, global providers, of course, play that role in terms of building up those local capacities, but donors can now start to work and identify, key local partners to start working with. And in addition to that, making sure that there's cost sharing agreements to ensure that the incentives between the enterprise, the BDS provider, and the donor themselves are all pushing in the same direction. And then lastly, what funders can do is they need to work to consolidate and align on a set of outcomes and metrics and data collection methods. So what we saw across providers was kind of a patchwork of different metrics and different data collection providers. And what we found was this was largely driven top down. So funders had different goals, different outcomes, different metrics that they wanted providers to measure. And so the outcome of that was that different providers were measuring very different things. One thing that funders can do to improve the data quality and comparability across the space is work kind of through existing channels together to align on a set of more standardized or aligned set of measurable outcomes. Next slide. So now the flip side of that is what can BDS providers do? So BDS providers, first and foremost, the flip side of that data collection is BDS providers can also work harder and more extensively to collect and share data in terms of cost data and performance data. And this is most specific to cost data, what we saw a wide range of cost accounting across providers. So there could and should be a concerted effort across BDS providers to work to align on cost metrics, and this will allow better comparability, like Hayden was mentioning before, easier to make those like comparisons, which ultimately is going to lead towards a greater cost effectiveness across the BDS space. And then secondly, what BDS providers can do is they can also, in terms of cost, they can work to implement and test more peer-to-peer approaches. So as Hayden mentioned a couple slides back, there are several cost and performance benefits towards group models. And so what BDS providers can do is they can start to integrate group models into a wider range of services when appropriate, and start to leverage some of those benefits that come from group-based versus individual-based models. In addition to that, just kind of re-emphasizing the importance that even when doing group-based models, there is that important aspect of charging something for the services. So we did see a significant improvement in performance, like I mentioned, when charging. And typically charging wasn't done through group-based models. So while group-based models should be implemented more broadly, they also have to come with the charging of fees. Next slide. Right, so that's kind of the overall presentation. I just want to wrap up lastly and reiterate what Michael and Hayden said, and send a big thank you to the steering committee who helped to fund and guide the work of this study. And additionally, I want to thank again the BDS providers whose information that was used in the study. We know it was a heavy lift. So thank you so much for participating. Then lastly, for anybody on the call today who hasn't done so yet, and you want to read the full report, our report is available on the ISF Advisors website. That's isfadvisors.org under the research section. So I'll now pass it over to Michael, who will introduce the next speakers. Over to you, Michael.
Thanks a lot for that, Hayden and Matthew. Really interesting findings. Thanks for keeping it short. We're almost on time, so I'll try to move quickly to the next two speakers, but I will remind everyone to please put your questions in the chat so that we can address those later on. So let me introduce now two speakers that we invited to essentially react to some of these findings. The first is Helena Eshetu, who's from the Ethiopia Regional Network Facilitator for the Agribusiness Market Ecosystem Alliance, EMEA, which is a rapidly growing network whose members share an interest in accelerating the development of professional farmer organizations. The second speaker is Helena is going to be representing more of the BDS provider side. The second, Gerard Wynn, who's an investment executive at Small Foundation, is going to be presenting the donor side. Small Foundation is a philanthropic foundation that's based in Ireland, and it works to catalyze and scale income generating opportunities for people living in extreme poverty in rural and sub-Saharan Africa. So welcome, Helena and Gerard. Helena, I'll start with you and basically just ask you, I think at a high level, trying to understand, which of the findings from this report do you think are most likely to influence the way that EMEA provides BDS? And in looking and considering these different types of findings and their importance, do you see some being more relevant to your servicing of farmers' organizations versus how you would address the needs of agri-SMEs? Thanks, Helena. Welcome.
Thank you, Michael. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a bit of a trick question because all of the findings are really important to what MA is trying to do. But in the interest of time, I will try to confine myself to a few. I'd say the first finding, which is also probably a challenge of the study, conducting the study, is about BDS being highly context dependent. And this has to do with two of the core things MA is trying to do, which has to do with learning and also standardization, because how do you make the findings and the lessons comparable so that you're actually capturing something that's useful for a range of BDS providers in a range of contexts? We want to be able to capture these lessons, but I think, as you've seen in conducting the study, it's very difficult because every organization has a different approach and uses different metrics. And from MEA, standardizing these approaches is important because that's how we're able to achieve scale. That's how we're able to share lessons. But at the same time, we don't want to lose the context-specific things that will actually make BDS targeted and able to meet the needs of the FOs and agri-SMEs. So that's one, trying to achieve the balance between the two. And I think this also relates to, I believe it was the fourth finding about the scale of the provider. We've seen that using local BDS providers is more cost effective, and it also brings in the local context, right? They're able to design approaches that are going to work in that country, in that region, in that project, whatever it may be. But on the other hand, having a regional or a global BDS provider, I think, offers more of a learning opportunity if they're able to share lessons across the different geographies in which they work. Therefore, they're able to scale up. So a pilot somewhere could be replicated elsewhere and scaled up. So there's more of an opportunity there. Again, so finding the balance between these two is another thing that we're going to be trying to do. Many of you here know that EMEA has a toolbox of assessment training and coaching tools. And a lot of our members work globally, or at least they work in multiple countries. So the lessons that they are able to gather on the ground feed into the improvement of these tools over time, which again leads to standardization, but we are constantly asking them to tweak based on the specific lessons they're learning in order to make them more effective. I would say the last, well, maybe one of the other ones is about enterprise fee coverage, in which it was seen that the FOs and agri-SMEs that contributed financially towards the BDS saw better results. But here I have a question. Are we able to establish causality, or is it a correlation? Because why is that the case? Is it that those that were willing to pay just had more resources to also implement the recommendations? Is it that it meant that they were more convinced? They'd been able to see, they believed in the results that were going to come from the BDS. So I think it's really important to actually understand what the causality there is. But this is an important point for the financial viability of BDS, in that we see in a lot of countries, very much so in Ethiopia, where I'm based, that BDS is provided by or funded by donors, and it's expected to be free or at least highly subsidized. But this is not financially viable. It doesn't make it attractive for BDS providers. It also means that the receivers are not necessarily invested in the services they're receiving. So in the local network countries, EMEA is initiating a roadmap process to improve BDS provision and delivery. But this is one of the key things we're trying to tackle, is about making it affordable so that the enterprises are able to contribute financially. And then I would say maybe one of the last recommendations, second to last recommendation you made to BDS providers, it just illustrates the importance of having detailed and accurate data on which to make informed decisions. I'll stop here. If there's time, I can say more later. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for that, Helena. I think that's a really interesting perspective, actually. I think making us think a little bit differently about some of the conclusions that come up, and also I think considering how this is going to be applied in practice, and what needs to be researched a little bit more, probably, to really assess those causalities, as you mentioned it. Gerard, I'll move on to you and ask you, from a donor perspective, which are of the findings do you think are most relevant for you, as you move forward with your selection process of BDS providers? And, how do you expect that the findings, especially in cost efficiency drivers, can be used by, donors like yourselves going forward?
Thanks, Michael. And to maybe give a bit more on Small Foundation's perspective, we've been working with BDS providers serving ag SMEs for close to 2 decades now in many different ways. But what hasn't changed has been a desire to increase the provision of high quality services that are effective in meeting the needs of ag SMEs, with a key focus on our end towards the sustainability of these services over the long term required to meet the need at scale. So to come to your questions directly, Michael, due to Small Foundation's focus on the sustainability of services, we've always had an eye to the cost of these services and how this relates to the quality and their effectiveness. The report dives into these questions around a number of variabilities and the segmentation approaches, which can't be ignored. And for this reason, Small Foundation strongly believes there cannot be a one-size-fits-all approach, and there's a need for the different delivery models at different times based on those needs. But for Small Foundation, this nuance has been most effectively met when driven at the local level, which points to one of the findings around our own selection processes. And that's regarding the prioritization and focus of support towards local providers. And Helena and ISF would be a better place to speak around that nuanced role between global and local providers. But for Small Foundation, in our direct partnerships, we've always looked to try and support local providers in looking to drive that cost efficiency, which comes out in the research itself for those local providers that participated. Small Foundation makes 2 main types of investments in this area. One is towards provider themselves, but in addressing some of these kind of more complex questions which the research pulls out, we also provide support towards ecosystem building initiatives. So those which aid knowledge flows, social capital and collaboration. So that includes research like this, but also support towards networks, be that SAFN or EMEA and many others involved. People have spoken already towards, but Small Foundation has historically pushed on, in our selection processes, the positive impact created by charging fees. And again, thinking of sustainability of services in mind, we've tried to experiment what that continued delivery of high quality services and how to drive effectiveness. And this does include charging of some level of fees. And the research kind of looks at this as well, which across all metrics, those that did pay some level of fees experience higher levels of impact. And this isn't to say, as Hayden mentioned, that all SMEs have an ability or a willingness to pay, and there's probably another webinar to discuss that. But it's to say that the data set had a relatively low amount of fee coverage, but where it was involved, there was a pointing towards effectiveness. And this is reflective of Small Foundation's experience. And how those fees are charged may require innovative approaches. And we've had experimented in many ways, admittedly varied success, but essentially we do believe and will in our selection processes further consideration for fees to be charged to kind of support this drive towards effectiveness. To kind of come to your second question, what's really coming out of us for the research is an increased focus towards these ecosystem building initiatives. And those are looking to support a larger evidence base, increase collaboration and alignment across the sector, and how we at Small Foundation might be able to support this in some way. So I think everything touched on feeds into our focus on what it takes to increase the level of high quality effective services to ag SMEs over the long term. And for us, cost is a key consideration when looking at this and to supporting ag SMEs and their stakeholders. At Small Foundation, we haven't been able to systematically collect data like this before, and seeing it brought together like this has given some real insights and learnings for us. But the hope, I guess, is that this is just a starting point, and recognizing it's a data set of a certain size with its own limitations. But I guess the main conclusion for Small Foundation has been the value in the collection of this data. And the hope is that others might see the value in understanding this relationship between effectiveness and cost efficiency of BDS. So I guess guess in this instance, our call to action would be whether others might consider this a priority in their approaches and support and incentivize the collection of this data, be willing to share this information, and hopefully build on this research and get a better understanding of how we might effectively support the needs of ag SMEs. And this needs to build on, as Matthew said, existing initiative and networks already in the ecosystem, but hopefully by expanding the knowledge base of what does and does not work, we'll be able for more strategic deployment of time, resources for funders, policymakers, practitioners alike. And this is something Small Foundation is going to be really focused on moving forward. And we welcome more engagement on this topic in particular. I'll stop there. Thanks, Michael.
Thanks a lot for that, Gerard. And it's really interesting to see the perspective of a donor that's as engaged and involved, I think, particularly in this in this space as Small Foundation, and good to hear that a lot of this can be actually applied and taken on board. We're about 5 minutes over, so I think we have about 15 now for Q&A. So I'd like to turn to some of the questions that came through the chat. So I'll thank both of our speakers now again for your interventions, and I'll move back now to Matthew and Hayden to answer some of these questions, if you will. I'm going to try to group them. So bear with me if you can. I think there's a first question that's essentially, a lot of it is trying to set a little bit more context and clarity around what is meant by BDS. With the first question that really asked, are we talking about, this is from Patrick Mujuni, about BDS being a one-time off investment. How did you go about defining BDS? And I think that probably leads to questions around your segmentation approach as well. I'm going to bring into this, if you can maybe write these down, looking at a question from Mathilde Bowen, who's asking, how did you deal with the attribution issue? And this was related to some of the first results that you showed in your presentation. And how did you identify the relationship between BDS and impact in terms of revenue growth and FTE creation? So I think these are more around what the approach was. And I'll go to a third one if you can take these three on at a time. Safeya Zaitoun, who is saying, so you talked about segmentation in terms of types of agri-SMEs, but could you share more about the segmentation in terms of types of BDS? So what kinds of services were provided? Were you able to draw any conclusions on the types of BDS? I think this is a recurring question, which is basically, rather than, I think, on the overall approach, group, blended, individual, was there more research on the actual type of service? Let me stop there. Tell me if you need any clarifications on these questions before you can answer. Thanks.
No, thank you, Michael. And yeah, thank you to everyone in the chat providing some really great questions. I think, unfortunately, just realistically won't be able to get to every one of them, but feel free to reach out to us for any clarifications. And as I did say, the full report does provide a lot more detail that we're able to provide, more than we're able to provide in about an hour presentation here. But I'll tackle that kind of attribution question and give a little bit more context about what we actually are talking about when we mean BDS in context of this engagement. So just for more information on that, so we collected this data from 15 providers across those 509 enterprises, as I said, and the way in which we did that was we essentially asked for data ideally on a if possible across 10 years. So kind of if year zero was the first date of BDS intervention for that specific enterprise. We asked for data about that enterprise, so revenue, FTE data, anything, 5 years prior to intervention and 5 years following intervention. And obviously that kind of differs, the length of intervention differs across different contexts, but all of this data is really talking about basically looking at so when we think about revenue growth or incremental revenue or FTEs, it's from that year kind of 0 to the end of the intervention. So that's just some context there. And again, a lot more kind of data and detail and supporting evidence in the report. But in terms of attribution, it's a really good question. And it's one that we thought really, really long and hard on and had a lot of discussions with the steering committee. And ultimately, what we were trying to do with this engagement was really focus on a like-for-like assessment methodology, where we were trying to compare, the effectiveness and the efficiency across different contexts in a like-for-like manner, rather than necessarily directly assessing the contribution or additionality of the BDS. So we weren't focusing necessarily on counterfactuals of, okay, what would the growth of a company have been without BDS? Totally acknowledging that is a fundamental kind of limitation of this study. But in our view and the view of our steering committee, there is a lot of interesting existing research out there that does look at that kind of additionality question. And what we wanted to do was focus more on the like-for-like assessment question. So hopefully that answers that question a little bit. In terms of the, thinking about the actual types of BDS provided, we segmented that across kind of a few buckets, big buckets of types of BDS. So core business support, access to finance, tech and product development. And within those, we had a series of kind of sub BDS categories, which again, we did include in that report. We didn't necessarily, as has been mentioned, and I think Helena made a really good point of business development services are fundamentally driven by the context they occur in and the outcomes that are trying to be achieved, the mission or impact you're trying to achieve. So there isn't an answer, and I've seen the question a few times of what type of BDS is most effective and most efficient. The answer is it's context dependent. What we did look at, and that's where this kind of segmentation comes in, and that's one of those key findings where there are certain types of BDS appear more commonly used and actually appear to be more efficient and effective in certain contexts. For instance, the kind of underlying basic core business support category of BDS, very basic kind of business practice training, how to file taxes, so on, right, is really applicable when you're trying to support cooperatives and producers, rather than kind of other types of SMEs, such as processors or traders, which are often more focused on kind of a little bit more of access to finance support and outcomes that associate with access to finance and so on. So we really don't want to say, yes, this is the type of BDS that is the best to provide, because ultimately it's very context dependent. What we do in this report is we give a little bit more information around, what's typically being used in what situations, and what are the kind of indicative outcomes that we saw. But it is still very context driven. Michael, I think I answered most of the questions that you said, but let me know if there's a key one I might have missed. If not, we can move on to a couple of
No,
ones.
I think we're going to move on just for the interest of, in the interest of trying to cover as many of these questions as we can. We knew that it was going to be a little tight, but let me move on to another group, which I think is really around the cost. And I'm going to go through a series of questions here as well. And, I think address them in the same way that you just did the first group. And the question here is, I think trying to understand, first, this is from Hannes from Rudical, who's asking what actually makes global providers more expensive or less cost efficient than local ones. So what is it that you found? I think someone Ina from CGIR is also asking about when you're comparing costs, what is it exactly that you're comparing? So is it the same type of services? Is it the same duration of the program? Like, how are we ensuring that the costs are comparable? And I assume that goes back to your first answer. And then Anne-Marie van Svinderen is asking about the use of a median rather than an average in terms of the cost that you used, and trying to understand also, which were the cheapest services, and I think that there it's trying to understand possibly, I think maybe the relationship between actually having cheaper services that lead to big impact. And if I may, I'm just going to throw in there, because I think this is one question that's just come up a lot, and it is somewhat related to cost and payment. Final question is going to be around this sense that there's a distortion in the ecosystem by the fact that funders do come in with grant money to support these services, and that ultimately this might have an effect on the effectiveness and efficiency. And I think people are very keen to understand what your thoughts or findings on that particular issue are. So thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. I can take these. And thanks everybody. These are all really good questions. Let me first start out by explaining how we approach calculating cost. So what we did was we wanted the cost of servicing an enterprise to be as holistic as possible. So we actually spent a considerable amount of time working directly with the BDS providers in order to understand the complete cost of servicing an enterprise. So that included any of those direct costs or indirect costs, any costs that were associated with acquiring that client, and any cost that was associated also with any follow-up analysis. So any reporting or any follow-up that might have happened maybe further years down the line. So we tried to get that cost number to be as holistic as possible. And then what we had the providers do is we looked at it we looked at it originally at both levels, but what we ended up using was actually at the enterprise level. So we actually had the cost of serving each of those 509 different enterprises, right? And so that's kind of how we went about it. So we were actually able to see, okay, this enterprise cost this much, this enterprise cost that much. And then how we looked at that when we segmented that, we were able to segment that by a number of those different characteristics. So we were able to segment that based on the type, right? Difference between core business and access to finance. Or for example, we were able to look at that from SDM, enterprises that received individual versus enterprises that received group-based models. So that's kind of how we approach cost and how we approach segmenting it. And then in terms of kind of using the mean and the median here, we actually looked at both. We ultimately decided to go with the median just because there was really a wide range of values that we got. And we wanted to make sure that we were using the right metric that would avoid all of those potential outliers. So we didn't want, one or two firms that might have been the most expensive to set up the whole sample. So that's why we decided to use the median. And then to answer Hannes's question, which was the first question, was around the costs of global versus local providers. And I think a bit of context here is interesting. So while we found that those local providers, there were cost benefits to working through local providers, the context of that is important. What we found is that global providers and local providers tend to, and not always, but tend to have different objectives. We found that global providers tend to work or have an objective such as building local capacity or working specifically in markets that might be underserved. So the overall target for those different programs tended to be different and tended to have different objectives. And so we want to just be clear that, that was one of the drivers of these cost differences. So yes, while local providers were cheaper overall to implement, global providers play a critical role in building up that local capacity in the first place. And then I think, Mike, can you remind me of the last question you threw in there?
Yeah. So last question in 30 seconds or less. It's basically the question around the influence or, a disruption caused by funding and grant funding of these services and how that can disrupt the ecosystem.
Yeah, good question. Okay, in 30 seconds or less. I think it's a very good point. We saw kind of a number of different responses and feedback on this point specifically. I think it's just important to recognize that the effects that funding has on the market are different everywhere, and they have to be tailored. And I think this is a good piece for further piece of research. But I just want to emphasize one point: is it's a lot about, I think a lot of the feedback that we were hearing was in terms of communicating benefits of these programs, and that largely, what we saw actually was that individual services, despite being less effective overall, were actually had the highest fee coverage. And so I think there's a large role that communication has to do with getting enterprises to actually pay for those services. And then secondly, actually one interesting takeaway that we found is that a lot of donor-funded projects, not only were they subsidizing those services, but they weren't asking for fees in the first place. So it was hard to assess whether enterprises would have actually paid for those fees in the beginning. They simply just weren't being asked. So it definitely plays a role, but I think there's an opportunity to dive deeper there.
And I would just say very quickly and this goes back to this point around kind of local providers, global providers. We encountered a lot of instances where there are kind of more commercially focused local providers that actually are building out this underlying ecosystem that, acknowledge that, yes, there are times in which a more subsidized approach from maybe funders, grant-based organizations is important, but recognizing when that maybe should stop, right? And recognizing when that local provided ecosystem is already built out to a point where actually the market can function on its own. So that goes back to kind of, it's a context, market by market driven thing, but understanding when that kind of the shift needs to happen is obviously crucial. And that's the $1 million question. But we saw that is clearly happening in areas where maybe, it's not assumed to be currently. So, yeah.
Excellent. Well, listen, thanks for that. I mean, obviously some really interesting findings and also some really good questions. So thanks to everyone who contributed. I think that, it's really highlighting the need for more work in this area, and there's a lot more to dig into. But now to close out this session with just 1 minute before the end, I'd like to introduce Frank Rubio, who's the interim SAFN coordinator, but also the senior technical advisor for the private sector at IFAD. Frank, welcome. I look forward to hearing your closing remarks.
Thank you, Michael. Very briefly, a big thank you again to the co-sponsors of this groundbreaking research, the participants in this event, which I thought were very interesting. As for conclusions, I mean, there's so many interesting points that were raised that it's very difficult to summarize But let me just mention a few high-level things that came to my mind as the discussions were ongoing, and maybe a couple of next steps for the SAFIN network per se. So the first thing that really struck me was some of the information on the importance of BDS to agri-SME business growth and access to finance. So, just only from the 15 BDS service providers, I wrote a couple of these down. There was mention of 36 million in revenue as a result of the BDS services provided, 100 million in financing raised, 2,750 full-time equivalent employment. So, clearly this kind of information and data underlies the key role that BDS plays in enterprise development. No surprise there, but it's great to have the data in place to demonstrate it. SAFIN as a network, our core objective is to facilitate greater access to finance for agri-SMEs. So, in a context where it's clear that in order to increase access to finance for what's considered to be a high-risk group and very costly group, the use of blended finance solutions is a critical piece to this, especially smartly used blended finance solutions. And of course, BDS and technical assistance geared towards strengthening demand and supply of appropriate finance is a critical piece of this smart blended finance package that's needed. On the very specific findings, just a couple of things that I found really interesting. In terms of fee coverage, I think the main conclusion that fee-paying SMEs have greater impact comes as really no surprise, at least not to me, drawn from the experience that we've had in the EFED private sector and some of the work that I had from my previous jobs. In EFED specifically, we're focusing on supporting the smaller, less evolved agri-SMEs. So the question on how do we incentivize these smaller ones to become more willing to pay is a critical aspect for us. I think Helena raised a really important issue about causality on why those that pay experience greater impact. So I think that's a really important question. I expect and suspect that there's other issues involved there, such as engagement of the management, more bottoms-up approaches in terms of defining BDS services that will be delivered, much more buy-in on the part of the staff and the management from the onset. So that kind of engagement also really increases the impact that the BDS services can have. I think the other point on local versus global providers is also really important. And the fact that local providers are more cost-effective is not surprising. We've seen that as well. But it raises the question, why then are there not more local service providers that are being used? There seems, in my view, to be more systemic issues in BDS markets and local BDS markets that need to be addressed to incentivize the demand and strengthen supply for these services. So I think a lot more work needs to be done there. Ultimately, SAFIN is fully aligned with the Small Foundation on the need to expand this data set, and we hope to be able to collaborate further on this to have much stronger evidence base and understand these questions much better. That's all I had to say. I just again want to thank everyone. And with that, I will close the session officially and hope we can have another one very soon on this very same topic.